Hey YouTube, welcome back. Happy Friday. Thanks for tuning back in again. My name is Devin and I'm your host as always. I apologize for missing last week's posting. I was on vacation in California visiting one of my bestest friends, so I was not posting to the YouTubes. But if you follow me on Instagram, you would have seen some of my adventures. But that's not what this video is about today. This is a brief history of DC Comics in the new Comics Histories playlist. The idea of this playlist is to take some defunct, older Golden Age comic book companies and some of the new ones and some of the ones that have ran the entire time and kind of sum up their histories in as short of a time as possible. So, quick disclaimer, this does not include every single major point in every single decade of every single comic book publishing company because that would take forever to film. So I'm going to take each decade that these comic book publishing companies have been opened, and I will sum it up in 3 to 6 facts. Again, this will not have all the key points. This will just have ones that I think were important in the development of these companies. If you disagree, if you want to add a fact, please put it in the comments below, or the comments, not comics, haha. And if you guys like this video and want to see more like this, please let me know again in the comments below, and make sure that you like it and share it and tell your friends. So without further ado, here's my brief history of DC Comics. Starting in the 1930s, it was opened in 1934 as National Allied Publications by Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. Sorry, I have my notes right here next to the camera. Mr. Wheeler Nicholson first published New Fun, the Big Comic Magazine #1, but it was dated February of 1935, not 1934. Now, sometime during the 1930s, Malcolm had actually incurred so much debt with one of his printers, Harry Donenfeld, that to cover the debt that National Allied Publications had incurred, he actually ended up becoming business partners with Harry Donenfeld, giving him a share of National Allied Publications, and they ended up opening DC Comics, or Detective Comics, with Wheeler and Jack Lebowitz as publishers. Now, that's a pretty major point in the 1930s, so it becomes DC Comics fairly quickly. Malcolm was actually present with the company up until issue 15 of Detective Comics, so he was a contributing writer to Detective Comics numbers 1 through 15. After that, he parted ways with the companies. Also in the 1930s, Superman and Batman were released. Superman came out in 1938, and Batman shortly followed behind him in 1939. That is the 1930s. Let me just scroll down for my next notes. Now, in the 1940s, so National Allied Publication and DC merged officially and came out as All American Publications. Or actually, they bought out All American Publications for Max Gaines. Max Gaines later went on to open EC Comics, but we'll talk about that in another video. Now, Leibowitz, or I think it's Leibowitz, began branding and releasing comics as Superman DC. So you'll see some older DC comic books saying Superman DC. That is why. Also in the 1940s, you saw the release of Flash, Hawkman, Green Lantern, and Wonder Woman in 1940, and then 1941 for Wonder Woman. So, 1940s. Moving into the 1950s, DC sues Fox Comics and claims that Wonder Man, which is later owned by Marvel Comics, is a Superman copy. And then they also sue Fawcett Comics, which they eventually absorbed, and claims that Captain Marvel was a Superman copy. Now, as you guys know, Captain Marvel later becomes Shazam, who is a extremely popular DC superhero, and I believe is at some point getting a movie or something like that. Also in the 1950s, you saw the mark of the beginning of the Silver Age, which was many people attribute to Showcase #4, the first release of Barry Allen, the new version of the Flash in 1954, and then later 18 issues after that in Showcase number 8 or 22, you see the release of Hal Jordan, their new take on the Green Lantern. So DC really helped usher in the new era of the Silver Age of comic books. Now, moving on to the 1960s, Carmine Infantino, one of my favorite artists of all time, becomes DC's editorial director, and then with the ushering in of the 1960s, DC ended up reinventing and revigorating the Batman and Superman families. Batman in the 60s saw the rise of Batwoman, Batgirl, Batmite, and Ace the Bat Hound, and then Superman was also kind of reinvigorated with Supergirl, Brainiac, and Bizarro. So you see a lot of expansion for these superhero families. You also see that National Publications was purchased by Kinney National Company, which later combined with Warner Bros. And became Warner Communications. Now, moving into the 1970s, you see the rise of Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams with their release of the anti-drug story in Green Lantern 85, where Speedy, the Green Arrow's ward, was shown to be a drug addict. This was actually, and this was against the Comics Code Authority, and this was in response to Amazing Spider-Man number 96, which was another anti-drug story, one of the first that was published without the seal of the Comics Code Authority, which was a very iconic issue written by Stan Lee. But in any case, also in the 1970s, you see Jeanette Kahn takes over as editorial director from Carmen Infantino, and DC needs to compete in the 70s with Marvel's boom from the 60s. So as you guys know, Marvel exploded in the 1960s with characters such as the X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all those guys. So DC needed to really catch up. So you'll see that they launched an array of titles in different non-superhero genres such as war, romance, and Western comics. And they also revived a lot of their Archie clones that they had in the 50s. Archie clones are real interesting. I'll make a video about that coming up later. But anyways, that is the 1970s. Coming up in the 1980s, you have a couple different things. So one, in an attempt to attract more creators and more business to DC Comics, they actually steered away from the just buyout option that they had for creators. So back then, creators would bring their ideas to DC Comics and they would just give them a flat fee and be like, boom, you're done, you don't have any more creative rights. And they started allowing royalties for creators who brought their characters to DC Comics, which attracted more business. This also allowed characters like Firestorm and things like that to kind of come into the DC universe. They also, in the 80s, launched the new Teen Titans, so that's like Raven, Cyborg, and, like Beast Boy and all that, which was released with Marv Wolfman and George Perez in DC Presents number 16 or 26, I forget. But I actually have a copy of it around here somewhere. But in any case, that was an iconic release, and then eventually you'll see the new Teen Titans number 1 and number 2, which was the release of Slade Wilson, or Deathstroke, I guess, whatever you want to call him. You also see the iconic storylines like Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller and The Watchmen story, which became a hit movie in later years by Alan Moore. Also in the 1980s, you see the first major crossover story, Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is way too much for me to explain right now. I've tried to read it like 4 times and I still get confused. So, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now that is the 80s and the end of the Bronze Age. We're coming into the Copper Age now in the 1990s. So a lot of you guys know in the 1990s you see Harley Quinn's debut in the Batman the Animated Series, as well as on paper in Batman Adventures number 12. Harley Quinn is an extremely popular character, which was even more popularized by the recent Suicide Squad movie, and her first appearance in comic form is going in the $700 to $800 value range in decent condition now. You also see that Warner Communications merges with Time and creates Time Warner, which is now the current owner of DC Comics. And then you see that the Death of Superman storyline becomes a major contributor to the near crash of the 1990s. Oh, there goes my pen. Now, a lot of you guys may have heard about the crash in the 1990s and how it was attributed almost directly to over-collecting, and that's another video for another time, but just keep that in mind. The Death of Superman really helped kind of push that, which kind of sucked. Now, to make up for these slumping sales, DC actually introduced more than 5 imprints to make up for that, including Vertigo Comics, which is still a very popular ongoing DC imprint now. And they purchased Wildstorm Comics, which was Jim Lee's imprint from from Image, and they've been publishing that for many years to come. So, that they kind of found their way out of it. Now, coming into the early 2000s, DC acquires the rights to many of Will Eisner's works, such as The Spirit. That was after Kitchen Sink Comics kind of crashed and burned. I think they resurfaced a few years. I had never paid attention to Kitchen Sink, but so they picked up a lot of. You'll see some old like The Spirit comics that are labeled DC. That is because DC acquired those rights in the early 2000s. Batman Begins was released in 2005, which sparked a new interest and brought in a lot of new fans to DC. And with that, they released Infinite Crisis, which was a weird sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. So that went from 2005 to 2006. And then finally, moving into modern day, that is the 2010s. So that is from 2010 to now 2017. So you see the DC relaunched their entire line of comic books with the Flashpoint Paradox. The new reboot was called The New 52, which many of you guys already know. If you guys are new, if you're watching this video just learning to get into comic books, The New 52 is a great place to start. And then The New 52 like kind of outlined the new hero or new heroes or old heroes and their, rebooted their origins to introduce new readers. So yeah, great place to start. And then in 2017, we saw the launch of DC Rebirth, and they combined DC Rebirth with so many of their old series. So now you picked back up with Detective Comics, 986 or something like that, as opposed to Detective Comics #1 again. So great start. And then also, I believe last year, AT&T reached a deal with Time Warner to purchase them for $108 billion. Now, this deal is currently in limbo. It is being reviewed by federal regulators. It's like an antitrust thing or something like that, because they control a lot of media and communication stuff. So that's sort of in limbo, but we're going to see what happens. And then DC is, reaching popularity with reaching high with popularity with all of their superhero movies. Even though not all of us are fans of it, we all still go pay to see it, and they're making a lot of money off of it. So that is a brief history of DC Comics in under 11 minutes. That's a lot of information to cram down. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you guys have any problems with redundancy, or if I say things twice, just make sure you let me know in the in the comments. Sorry, I had to sneak that in there. And yeah, that's it. So make sure you subscribe, and thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week.